Welcome back and thank you for joining us. I've created a PowerPoint presentation entitled The Police and Racial Profiling. I then divided that presentation into several segments for easier online viewing. This is Dr. Eric Hillman. When we talk about racial profiling, what are we talking about? Some say it's also known as DWB. What does that mean? Driving while black or brown, walking while black, shopping while black. So if someone has black or brown skin, is a minority in the United States, does that mean that they are going to be singled out while driving, while just walking, while shopping? Are they suspected of being guilty of a crime solely because of the color of their skin? And that would apply to both police and non-police operatives. In this presentation, we're going to discuss reasons for racial profiling. We'll also look at both federal and state law as it applies to racial profiling. We'll look at the 4th and 14th Amendments. We'll give some examples of what appears to be racial profiling, at least to some. And we're going to talk about facts and opinions. Some of those facts will come in the form of government studies or private studies, and they'll involve some statistics. We'll also talk about opinions. We'll give opinions of several prominent people on the issue of racial profiling, both black and white. And we'll also consider some lay opinions on the subject. Well, why are you here watching this video today? Was it because you had nothing better to do? Probably not. Maybe ETBU forced, or rather suggested, that you attend class today. Certainly you're going to get a class attendance credit for watching this lecture, and that's probably why most of you are here. But open your minds a little bit. We're not here to say any one person or point of view is right or wrong. We're trying to discuss the issue from all viewpoints so we can all have a better understanding of the issue and of people's impressions of the issue. What's the difference between legal and moral? Well, laws are legal. Laws are based on morality. When Texas law says it's illegal to kill someone, that's based on the Mosaic law coming from Moses, thou shalt not kill. Texas and federal law has changed in the area of racial profiling. Most of the states changed their laws around 2001 to 2003. And that's the legal imperative. The moral imperative is that racial profiling is wrong. We should not judge people by the color of their skin. What did Dr. Martin Luther King say? He said that he hoped and waited and dreamed of a day when his children would be judged by their character and not the color of their skin. So interestingly, although we agree that you should not be judged by your skin color, the implication is it is okay to judge people by their character. So if someone's assumed to be a thief or a criminal because of their skin color, that's wrong. However, if someone's behavior, that is literally stealing something, makes them a thief, then yes, we can, as human beings, assign to them bad motive, bad behavior, and we can protect ourselves from that behavior by profiling their behavior. So, what is racial profiling? Is it stereotypes at their worst? The worst racists in our country are in favor of racial profiling? Or is it good police work? If police are good at catching criminals, and they do catch criminals, does the fact that, for instance, a certain police officer catches more black or Hispanic or Asian criminals than white criminals, does that mean he's a bad officer? Or does that mean he's a good officer? He's good at catching criminals. Is racial profiling useful? If an officer assumes that a higher percentage of, say, young black males are involved in violent crime than young Asian males or young Hispanic or white males. Does that mean he is using a tool that's useful to catch criminals? If it is useful, is it politically incorrect? If it is politically incorrect, is that the only reason that racial profiling is wrong, or is it inherently evil? Well, what if it is evil? What if racial profiling is evil? Is it a necessary evil? Is it something we need to allow the police to do to catch criminals? These are all questions that we're going to address in this PowerPoint presentation. We all have different perspectives. As you look at the black and white picture on the screen, what do you see? Some people saw a black table leg. Other people saw two white silhouettes of people looking at each other. So who's right and who's wrong? Maybe half the class saw the black table leg or table base. Does that mean they're wrong, or does that mean the people who saw the two white silhouettes were wrong? Does it have to be one person's right, one person's wrong? Or is it possible they were both right, but they simply have different perspectives? And I think the question answers itself. We all have different life experiences, and those life experiences shape our perspective. So, normally we have this discussion in class, and it's a pretty decent discussion because we invite lots of people to give their perspectives. As you do this online, unfortunately, you don't have the advantage of hearing other people's perspectives. But I endeavor to value the perspectives of all students. And as we go through this presentation, we're not trying to belittle anyone's perspective, but we're trying to help all of us understand each other's perspective. One good way of looking at differing perspectives is by using the definition of conservative and the definition of liberal. I learned the definition of conservative as a police officer. Police officers tend to be more conservative than the general population. Now, among police officers, people are politically conservative and politically liberal and everywhere in between. And yet, overall, if we took an average, probably the police would be a little bit more conservative than the general population. So what is a conservative in a police officer's definition? A conservative is a liberal who's been mugged. What does that mean? Well, a typical liberal may be anti-police. We don't need the police interfering in our life. We don't need a police state. We need more freedom. And yet when he's mugged or robbed or the home invasion or burglarized, he calls 911 and he demands the police response. He demands that the police look in his neighbor's garage because he thinks his neighbor stole his bicycle. He demands that the police knock down the door of a nearby garage where he thinks his stolen car might be. And the police have to explain to him, no, we can't do that. The Fourth Amendment doesn't allow us to do things like that unless we have reasonable suspicion and or probable cause. And this liberal who's anti-police suddenly becomes conservative. He wants lots of police powers. Well, that's the definition of conservative that I learned as a police officer. On the other hand, what is a liberal? Well, this is interesting because I spent many years as a police officer before I became an attorney. And in law school, I learned the definition of a liberal. A liberal is a conservative who's been arrested. What does that mean? Well, your typical conservative is pro-police, pro-law and order, anti-bad guy, throw the criminals in jail for the rest of their life and throw away the key. But suddenly, if that conservative finds himself arrested, he then quickly calls a lawyer, and that lawyer tells him, you have a right to remain silent. Don't talk to the police. Don't plead to anything. Don't agree to anything. We're going to fight this. We're not going to let the government and the police railroad you. Basically, this conservative, once he becomes arrested, becomes a sudden liberal. So which of these two perspectives is right? Well, it depends on your perspective. What happens to you in your life shapes your perspective. And that's why when we look at these two definitions, we can learn from both of them. So, since our experiences shape our perspective, and since I'm the teacher, I guess I owe it to you to give you a little bit of my life perspective so that when I talk on the subject, you can understand better where I'm coming from. So, I was raised in a rural dairy farm. This was an all-white area of Minnesota. A lot of people in the South don't understand the demographics. In the South, black and white population are distributed both in the cities and in the country. In the North, almost the entire black population is concentrated in the cities, and there's large areas of rural area that are mostly all white, or maybe some Hispanic or some American Indian, and that's because the blacks who came north, either before the Civil War or after the Civil War looking for jobs, basically concentrated in the cities because that's where the jobs were. So it's different. In the northern states, you can be raised in towns where there's zero or very few black Americans. So it's an all-white area. But then, when I was in the 10th grade, we moved to the inner city. My dad lost his job in this small town. We moved to the inner city, and we found ourselves as the only white family in an all-black neighborhood. So that was a culture shock for me in the 10th grade. Well, living in this all-black neighborhood, I was racially profiled by both drug dealers and the police. So if a drug dealer saw me, and I ran cross country in high school, so I did a lot of running through the neighborhood, and if a drug dealer saw me, he would think, well, what's this white guy doing in our neighborhood? He must be here to buy drugs, and they'd try to sell me stuff. And if the police saw me, they would think, why is this white guy hanging around this all-black neighborhood? Maybe he's here to buy drugs. And so the police would also racial profiling me. Interesting reversal of what we normally think of as racial profiling. We were crime victims many times, but that was both places. Our house was broken into 2 or 3 times while we lived on the farm. And one time they did catch the people that did it, and guess what? It was 2 white guys that broke into our house on the farm when we weren't there. Well, our house was broken into in the city 3 different times in this all-black neighborhood, and they only caught the people one time there also, and they were, guess what, 2 black guys. My dad was assaulted. It was black people that did it, and I was also assaulted, black people that did it. Well, does that mean that black people are evil? Well, no. Of course, if I'm going to be a crime victim in a black area, it'll be black criminals. When I was a crime victim in the white area, it was white criminals. And so it's important to point out that criminals come in all different colors, and good people come in all different colors. And really, good and bad is not a function of skin color, it's a function of character. Was I a victim of racism? Yes. It was very easy when I lived on the farm. When I was a kid, 5th and 6th grade, I was bullied and picked on by older kids. I guess all of us were at some point in our life. And on the farm, the bullies that picked on me were white, because it was a white area. When I lived in the inner city, the bullies that picked on me were black. It became very easy for them to try to prove themselves by picking on the white kid, the cracker, the honky, the whatever you want to call it, and that was me. So it would be easy for me to be angry at black people and say, you know what? Black people are criminals, are always trying to attack us and rob us. Well, if I lived in a black neighborhood, that would be my experience, so that would be my perspective. But if I had stayed living in the white area, then all of the people who victimized us, all the criminals who burglarized, attacked, whatever, they would all be white. And so then my perspective would be that these bullies are white people. And it all depends on our perspective, on our life experiences. I did develop what I call a drugs-church dichotomy while I lived in this black neighborhood, and that was I found both the best and the worst people in my life in that black neighborhood. The worst, the drug dealers, the criminals, the violent gangs that I had to avoid. that running cross country came in handy. I ran away from trouble more than once. But also, I found the best people that I've ever met, the kindest hearts when I was living in the black neighborhood. And when I was approached by someone I didn't know, when I was running or walking or biking through that black neighborhood, they would usually either, if it was a black person who didn't know me, they would usually either offer to sell me drugs or invite me to church. One time when our house was broken into, my mother was scared and she didn't want to go to sleep, afraid that they would come back. And there's a black guy lived down on the corner, a very friendly guy, and he came and sat in his car and actually slept in his car parked in front of our house. Said, "I'll watch the house, Mrs. Hillman. I'll watch the house for you," just to show her that he had a good heart, that lots of black folks in the area had a good heart. I don't know of any person in any of the white neighborhoods I've lived in that had ever gone that far to give reassurance to us and comfort to us. So again, the drugs church dichotomy. And this is just my perspective. It doesn't have to be yours. But I found both the worst people and the kindest people in my life when I lived in that black neighborhood. I come from a multiracial family. Grew up with a Korean foster sister. My mother always made sure that we had international students from the University of Minnesota over because she wanted to expose us to different perspectives. My mother had been raised in an all-white small town where my mother as a child all through high school even told racial jokes because in an all-white town that was easy to do. It was easy to blame black people for life's problems. And then she went to the University of Minnesota and she told a racial joke and she was immediately chastised for it. And she was introduced to many people of color. I say, that to put in one group, blacks, whites, Asians, Hispanics, and she found that these were some very friendly people. And my mother, she had to change her perspective and reevaluate what she had been taught by her parents. And so she didn't want her kids, that's me and my brothers and sisters, to grow up in a racist home environment like she had grown up in. So she made sure we were exposed to international students from different countries. We had people over from other countries who were going to the University of Minnesota, from the Middle East, from Africa, from Asia, and we'd invite them over for dinner so that we could be exposed to their cultures. She made sure we had friends of all different races because she wanted us to judge people not by their color of the skin, but by their character, just like Dr. Martin Luther King encouraged us to. I have several black family members. My sister married a black man, so I have a couple of nieces who are black. My other sister married a Hispanic man, and she had 5 kids, all of whom are, of course, half Hispanic. And some of you know that my wife is of mixed race. She's part white, part black, part Hispanic, part American Indian. So this is Jasmine, my sister-in-law. Met a man and had a relationship with him, and Jasmine was born, but he took off. Jasmine never knew her dad, so she's my niece, and yet I raised her as my own daughter. And the reason I bring her up is this is a picture of us at a park in Conroe, north of Houston. But we were in Walmart in Conroe one day, and she was walking next to my ex-wife, who's white, and Jasmine is clearly mixed. And there was some redneck racist who made a comment about how, looking at Jasmine and looking at my ex-wife, who's white, of how wrong and bad it was for a white woman to be with a black man and produce a half-breed kid, etc. And I got really angry. I was standing off in the distance a little bit, looking at men's clothes while they were looking at women's clothes, but I heard this, and they kept on walking. I don't think Jasmine even heard it, but I was angry and I was ready to confront them, and I thought, well, here I am, off-duty police officer. I wasn't in uniform or anything. I could have started a fight. I could have gotten into a fight, but the cameras at Walmart would have picked it up, and I would have been charged with assault, and I would have lost my job. But what's my takeaway from all that? My takeaway was I was angry enough, based on their racist comments towards my niece, I was angry enough to get into a fight over it. Fortunately, I was able to control my temper, and I didn't, and they walked away, and to this day I don't know who they were. But I thought, what if I had? That would have made me a criminal. My anger would have made me a criminal. I would have lost my job. So it's easy for me, and to my white students listening, it's easy to say, why don't you black people just get over it? Why are you so sensitive? Why? Because our perspective is that we haven't been victims, perhaps, of racism. But from a black perspective, when you're a victim of racism, it hurts. And it hurt when my little 5-year-old niece was a victim of racism, and I wanted to take action. But that action that I took, the anger that I had, if I had expressed it, would have been criminal. And so we can sometimes look at black folks who respond in anger to racism and blame them for not controlling their temper, and blame them for being angry, and then blame them for being criminals. But until you've actually experienced it personally, it's a little hard to judge others for that. My mother went to Africa on a Peace Corps type mission, and she went to the country of Senegal. That's in far west Africa. And she went to a little town called Marsassoum. Well, the older people in Marsassoum had seen white people before, because Senegal in Africa used to be a French colony, so they had seen French people there. Of course, no Americans had been there. But these kids had never seen a white person before, and so my mother, as she would walk through the village talking with the tribal elders, sometimes these kids would run up behind her and they would pinch her and scratch her and run away. And she was quite alarmed at this and brought it to the attention of the tribal elders, and they called the entire village together for a meeting and asked why everyone was so mistreating this white woman. And as it turned out, as they talked to these kids, they had never seen white people before, and they were sure that since all skin is dark, all skin is black or dark brown, that this woman must really be black, but she's just coated with some kind of substance to make her white. And so they were scratching her and pinching her to see if they could get that white stuff off her skin, to see if they could see her real skin. They had never seen such a thing as a white person. That was an oddity to them. And so my mother was asked to explain to the kids, and she said, well, I'm from the United States. Well, most of the kids hadn't heard of that. Where is that? Is that by France? No. Where is that? Is that by Dakar? No, Dakar is on the west coast of Senegal. When you get to Dakar, anything farther west than Dakar is simply the Atlantic Ocean. And she said, I live farther west than Dakar. And all the kids laughed, because they know that Dakar is the end of the world. After that, there's just ocean. But she explained, no, the distance from this small town to Dakar, I live 100 times farther than that, farther west. And of course, she had to explain that on the other side of the ocean, there was another country. And they said, well, is everyone there white? No, in our country, they have all different colors of people: red, yellow, black, white, brown. And they said, we want to see some pictures. So my mother, who was an organist and piano player in a black church, pulled out pictures of some of her black friends, and she had some lighter-skinned black friends, like, say, President Obama. President Obama is black, but much lighter than the kids in this picture. And she said, here's some of my black friends. And they said, no, no, no. And because she showed them pictures of her lighter-skinned black friends, and then the kid said, no, these are your white friends. We want to see your black friends. And then she realized that lighter-skinned blacks appeared white to these kids. We have a saying in this country, a little black, all black. We call Obama our first black president, even though he's actually half white. And this phrase comes from the pre-Civil War times, where different states had different laws on who was black and who wasn't. And so in some states, You're black if you're half black, some if you're a fourth black, some if you're an eighth black, you're considered black. And that made a difference in the antebellum or pre-Civil War period, because whether you're black or white would make a difference between whether you were a slave or not. And you had interesting situations in Louisiana and some other states where someone who was 1/4 black could be a slave owner and could own someone who's half black or all black as a slave, depending on the state laws. So that's where we get our saying, a little black, all black. Well, in Marsassoum, Senegal, they had a saying, a little white, all white. That was their perspective. So who's right? Are we right? A little black, all black? Or are these kids right? A little white, all white? Well, it depends on our perspective. We all have different experiences, different cultures, and neither one of us is wrong. We are both right from our perspective. So as we talk about this subject, let's not concentrate on arguing who's right or wrong. Let's concentrate on understanding each other's perspectives. This is my daughter Jessica. She went to live in an orphanage in Zimbabwe. And when she went there, her first day there, she came and took pictures and played with the kids. And at the end of the day, they said, "Why are you still here?" "Well, what do you mean?" And they said, "Well, when the white people come here to the orphanage in Zimbabwe, they come and take pictures with us, and at the end of the day, they go back to town and stay at the hotel." And Jessica said, "No, I'm going to stay here and live with you." And she actually worked at that orphanage for quite a while, went back several times to work there. And they were all really impressed that a white person could actually live with black people. That's something that, based on their limited perspective of white people, had never happened before. Interesting to see different perspectives. So what are a police officer's perspectives? Most police see racial profiling as a political issue rather than a moral or legal issue. They see it as being very emotionally charged, as something that people get on their soapboxes and yell and scream about, but don't truly understand what police officers have to do. And police feel that community leaders falsely accuse officers of racism and racial profiling. Most officers feel they're doing a good job, that they're not making arrests or stops based on race. They're basing it on criminal behavior, and they feel like they're being falsely accused by politicians. Officers get angry and defensive when they're falsely accused, but really doesn't everyone? If you were falsely accused of a crime or falsely accused of bad behavior, wouldn't you become angry and defensive about it? I think most of us do. So then the question is, in our minds and the officers' minds, is it really racism, or is it just a race card? Meaning racism that the officer truly is, judging people by the color of their skin, or is it simply politicians using the race card to try to get votes, for instance, in the liberal white community or the black community? And see that these are issues we have to look at. From the officer's perspective, we've got to consider the source of the accusations. Yes, the media accuses police of racism, but the media is looking for sensationalism. In order for the media to get followers and sell newspapers or sell advertising on the internet, they have to sell conflict and fear. By selling that, they get more people interested, more people read the articles, and as the readership goes up, they can charge more money for advertising. So the media specifically looks for conflict and fear to write about. Politicians want votes from different constituents they have. One of the best ways to get votes is to create an enemy for your constituents, for the voters, and then say, "But I will protect you from that enemy." And then the people vote for him or her. Special interest groups also want to satisfy their constituents. Some special interest groups are doing a good thing in protecting people from true racism, from true discrimination. Other special interest groups will create racism and discrimination where none exists. Well, officers can discredit some of the accusers. Certainly some of the accusers don't have credibility. But some of the accusations of racism and racial profiling may be true. Well, if we are falsely accused as police officers, we must defend against those accusations, and specifically, it's okay to point out the lies in the news media. On the other hand, if there are some officers who are racist or engage in racial profiling, the police have a duty to clean up their own house or their own act. The police have the duty, the good police officers have a duty to not allow racism in the police department in the form of a handful of bad officers. Well, what is racial profiling? And what is racism? According to Webster's dictionary, racism is an assumption of inherent racial superiority. Well, that sounds a lot like Nazis, doesn't it? That the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white-skinned people are the master race. Racial profiling, on the other hand, is using a suspect's race as a factor when initiating police action. And we'll actually talk about the Texas legal statutory definition of racial profiling coming up. But we see here that racism is not the same as racial profiling. Some officers, but not all, do engage in racism and racial profiling. And when they do, it's wrong. There's no way around it. There's no way officers can justify racism or racial profiling. We've got to admit that it's wrong. We've got to admit that we shouldn't allow it in the police department or sheriff's office. However, as we're going to see with some of the studies that we're going to talk about in future segments, even some minority, some black and Hispanic officers engage in racism and racial profiling. So nobody, that is, I shouldn't say nobody, no race is immune to racism. Racism and racial profiling, but specifically racism, comes in all different colors also. There is white racism against blacks, white racism against Hispanics, black racism against whites, black racism against Hispanics, Hispanic racism against blacks, and Hispanic racism against whites. Now that's just the three main groups. We could add to that Asians, American Indians, and a bunch of other groups. But racism goes each way, so don't fool yourself or delude yourself into thinking that only white people are racist. Any person of any race can be racist if he chooses to be. So here's some racist stereotypes. Why are these racist stereotypes? First one, blacks are criminals. So why is that a racist statement? Because it takes everyone in the first category, blacks, and puts them in the second category, criminals. The assumption then is that if you're in the first category, being black, then you are in the second category, being a criminal. That's obviously not always true. If we said some blacks are criminals, that would be a true statement. But to simply say blacks are criminals, the implication is that you are saying all blacks are criminals, which isn't true. But if you said whites are criminals, that would be a racist statement also, because you're taking everyone in the first category, white, and putting them in the second category, criminal. If we said some whites are criminals, that would be a true statement. Hispanics are drunks. Ever heard that? Again, a racist statement. Why? Because it takes everyone in the first category, Hispanics, and puts them in the second category, drunks. The implication is all Hispanics are drunks. If we put the one word in there, some Hispanics are drunks, that would certainly be a true statement, but we could also say some whites are drunks. So we don't want to make blanket statements of putting everyone in the same category. Well, what if a person who's black or Hispanic says to you, white cops are racist? Well, guess what? That's a racist statement. That black person or Hispanic person who says that is a racist because they're taking everyone in the first category, white cops, and putting them in the second category, racist. If we said some white cops are racist, well, unfortunately, I've got to agree that's a true statement, but certainly not all. And so don't find yourself making racist stereotypes like this. You as an educated person should know better. Consider this quote. When I walk down the street and I hear footsteps behind me, I think I might be a robbery victim. Then I look around and I see a white person and oh, now I feel relieved. The implication is you're walking down the street, someone's coming behind you, maybe you're going to be robbed, you turn around and oh, it's a white guy, okay, I'm not going to be robbed. The implication is if it was a black person, this person would still be afraid of being robbed. Is that racial profiling or is that racism? Well, who said that statement? Was that a Ku Klux Klan member or a skinhead or a white racist cop? Actually, that was the Reverend Jesse Jackson. He stated that in 1993. Who is Jesse Jackson? Well, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have to ask that question. Everyone knew who Jesse Jackson was. Jesse Jackson was a black reverend who was an associate of Dr. Martin Luther King, was actually there present when Dr. King was killed. He ran for president, Jesse Jackson ran for president on the Democratic ticket in 1984 and 1988. Prior to the appearance of Barack Obama on the scene, who Barack Obama originally ran for senator and won in Illinois, and then ran for president, and as we know, he won. Well, Barack Obama at this point is the leading black politician in our country, but prior to the appearance of Barack Obama, Jesse Jackson was the leading black politician in our country. And here we have the leading black politician saying, when he sees black people behind him and following him at night, he's afraid. When he sees white people, he's not. So is Jesse Jackson a racist? Is he racially profiling? Well, I don't know if he's a racist because I can't see in his heart. I have to assume that he's not. But clearly he is racial profiling. Is it wrong for this black leader to racial profile against other blacks? Well, you have to decide for yourself. Consider this quote, "I want to be the black man's brother, not his brother-in-law." This was said by Dr. Bob Jones of Bob Jones University. Bob Jones University is in Greenville, South Carolina. And they had a policy. This is a big university, many thousands of students. They had a policy of no interracial dating. Black students couldn't date white students. Now, they claimed that they weren't racist, and in fact, they admitted black students, and they had black teachers on the faculty. But they took a verse in the Old Testament that said Jews should not marry non-Jews, and they said that means that God doesn't want a mixing of the races, because Jews are one race and everyone else is a different race. Well, I disagree with Bob Jones' opinion. I think that when the Bible says Jews should not marry non-Jews, what they really mean is, in a religious sense, believers in God should not be marrying non-believers in God. But Bob Jones University took that to mean that races should not mix. Well, that was kind of convenient in the Old South, based on much of the racism that comes from the Old South. This is South Carolina. Bob Jones University eventually changed their policy, allowed interracial dating, and actually the Bob Jones University, Dr. Bob Jones' son, who later became President Bob Jones II, or the third, I can't remember which, actually apologized to the world for that policy, and apologized for the segregation and the racism, and changed the policy to allow interracial dating. But when we look at this, he said, the original Dr. Bob Jones said, "I'm not a racist. I want to be the black man's brother," meaning I believe as a Christian that a black man who's a Christian is my brother, but I just don't want to be his brother-in-law. In other words, I don't want him marrying my sister. And that seems like a racist statement. But consider this quote, "I want to be the white man's brother, not his brother-in-law." Well, this is said by a black man. Is that a racist statement? I want to be the white man's brother in Christ, but not his brother-in-law. I don't want him marrying my sister. That was actually said by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on September 10th of 1962. Does that mean that Dr. Martin Luther King was a racist? I don't think so. But based on the perspectives of the time, Dr. Bob Jones Sr., being raised in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, had his perspective on mixing of the race. Dr. Martin Luther King in the 1960s was living in a time in history when interracial dating was actually illegal in the South. Interracial marriage did not even become legal, according to the Supreme Court in the southern states. Loving versus Virginia is the name of the case, until 1967. So it was actually illegal to be interracially married until 1967 in many states. And that's the South Carolina, that Dr. Bob Jones grew up in. That's the southern part of the country that Dr. Martin Luther King grew up in. And so their perspectives were tainted by the times they grew up in. Is Dr. Bob Jones a racist? You decide for yourself. But if he is, based on his statement, are you also concluding that Dr. Martin Luther King was a racist? Perhaps neither one was racist, but was simply a product of the times and the environment and the culture they lived in. I don't know, because I can't know either one's hearts, so you be the judge. Well, that's the end of part 1. Thank you for joining us, and once you finish this, I encourage you to continue to part 2. Thanks, and have a great day.